It's a reality for many people that at some point you're going to start losing your locks. Luckily though, wrestlers have long had a way to maximize this in the form of hair versus hair matches, something which can allow them to draw a little money from the process. And because these matches have been so historically popular then, it meant even if you're not receding up top, you can still use the idea to gain some fan interest. But what are the best examples of performers doing this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into haircuts, wrestlers who got shaved bald. And as always, if we're going to start anywhere, let's do so with one of the most notable examples of this happening, and that's the time Kurt Angle decided to bite the bullet and take a razor to his skull in 2002. What was the story behind this one? Well, in the spring of that year, the Olympic gold medalist had entered into a feud with Edge, one which saw the two reach such a level of bitterness with each other, it was decided the only way to settle things once and for all would be on pay-per-view. So that was how, at Judgment Day on May 19th, the pair met one-on-one. That said, this wouldn't be any ordinary match. No, to ensure the loser felt the maximum amount of embarrassment, it would be hair versus hair. And while some may have expected Edge to lose here as his long locks were a trademark for him at the time, in the end it was Angle who fell to something as simple as a small package, and as a result, had to face the shears. But what makes this all the funnier in kayfabe is that, even if Kurt's hair was receding here, there was no reason it shouldn't have started to grow back pretty quickly. So you'd think that after spending weeks wearing a badly fitted wig then, by the time this was removed, the Pittsburgh native would be back to normal again. Except he wasn't. No, after Hulk Hogan eventually removed his toupee, it was revealed that Angle was still bald as a baby. And this was a state he would remain in for the rest of his career as it turned out. Of course, such a thing presented a storyline issue, as well in reality he'd simply decided he'd preferred the more streamlined look. In kayfabe, Kurt was supposed to be desperate to get his hair back. So the only explanation we were left to assume from the entire incident was that the shears Edge used on him had some kind of alopecia-inducing magic properties which prevented his mane from growing back at all. But even if this was all a little bit silly, going bald was probably the best thing the former WWF champion could have done at this point in his career, as it instantly refreshed him and made him look more like the in-ring killer he was already transforming into. And he's not the only one who actually benefited from shaving his head in the long run either, because in 2010, the exact same thing happened with CM Punk. Yes, Kane, Michael Punk, everyone's favorite troublemaker, was developing a bit of a cult of personality around himself on SmackDown at this time, and it was exactly that ability to draw others towards him which led him to creating an army in the form of the Straight Edge Society. And in order to be inducted into his stable, you first had to show your loyalty by shaving your head bald. Of course, there were a few who were happy to do this, most prominently Serena Deeb, but when it came time for Dollars and Cents Phil to do the same himself, like with any hypocritical cult leader, he wasn't as willing. No, when Rey Mysterio, his chief rival at the time, wanted him to put his hair on the line during their match at that year's Over the Limit, he at first refused, with the Second City Saints only agreeing once Rey agreed to join the Straight Edge Society himself should he fail to win. Perhaps predictably though, once this was agreed to and the time for the bout came, the babyface did not lose, and so, as a consequence, the up until then trademark long greasy locks of Punk were cut off. Not that he would let fans see his shame for a while yet, as, for the next couple of months, the voice of the voiceless took to wearing a mask which covered his head from view, with this only being removed when the Big Show got his hands on him in August. But it wasn't as if the eventual reveal of his shaved head hurt his career in the long run. No, you could argue it actually made him look more like a main eventer. So when he cut his now famous pipe bomb the following year and became the biggest star in the industry, it felt like he fit right into the role. What of the man who eventually revealed his newly shorn scalp to the world though? After all, when the Big Show first debuted in 1996, he also had a head full of hair. This, however, would change for him in 2004 because it was then that he was the victim of a dart gun attack and a subsequent visit to an impromptu barber. Yes, wrestling can sometimes be ridiculous, and few examples show this more clearly than the time when, while feuding with Kurt Angle during the latter year, Paul White found himself being treated like a big game animal at a safari. How did this play out? Well, after deciding the giant was simply too large to be taken down by any normal means, the Olympic hero resorted to using a dart gun loaded up with a tranquilizer. That's right, in a scene which was more Roadrunner than anything else, the Big Show was felled by a chemical attack, one large enough to put him to sleep right in the middle of the ring. And it was while he was asleep that Angle took advantage of the situation and embarrassed his rival by shaving him bald. What he didn't count on, though, was that, once separated from his hair, White actually looked even more menacing, as he now had a greater resemblance than before to previous dominating big men such as King Kong Bundy. Hell, such a good look was this on him in general that, even if his hair did grow back soon enough, by the time 2008 rolled around, the Big Show was going with the bald look once again. And since that point, he's continued to keep things the same way, meaning that at this point, there's a whole generation of fans who won't even remember the fact that he ever had hair at all. But while the South Carolina native is probably the most prominent example of a giant getting their head shaved inside of a wrestling ring, what if we look to the opposite end of the spectrum for a moment? Yes, on occasion it's a little person instead who has to undergo the process of losing their precious mane, which was exactly what happened to Hornswoggle in 2014. Let's backtrack for a second first in order to get some context though, because it was in the spring of that year that Dylan Postal turned heel for the first time in his career after aligning with 3MB. And this soon led to him getting into a program with fellow little person El Torito then, with the subsequent feud between the pair spanning multiple pay-per-view encounters. But while their WLC bout at May 4th's Extreme Rules might be the most fondly remembered now, it's actually the mask versus hair match at the following month's Payback which is more relevant for us today. And that's because it was at this one that, following a loss to his chief rival, Hornswoggle was forced to sit there as his head was shaved bald by the victor. But it wasn't all bad, because for someone who'd so often been fighting to get TV time over the years, his willingness to go along with anything that was asked of him here meant Postal's stock would rise in the boss's eyes, and as a result, he'd soon find himself in further notable positions alongside acts such as Adam Rose and Slater Gator. When it comes to our next subject today, however, we can't say he had such a great time in WWF after shaving his own head, and that was because only a year after Jeff Jarrett did this in 1998, he'd be gone from the company altogether under less than ideal circumstances. Still, at least he didn't have the exact same experience as some of his peers had with similar angles, as in the case of the Chosen One, he never truly got his hair cut off completely. No, if you actually go back and watch his hair versus hair match against X-Pac at that year's SummerSlam, you'll see that following his loss, he really just got a nice haircut. Why was this? Well, the electric razor, which was supposed to do the job, didn't work properly on the night, with this creating visible frustration for all involved. So, quickly needing to improvise then, Sean Waltman brought announcer and rival of Jarrett, Howard Finkel, into the ring, and from there handed him a pair of scissors as the two got to work. Clearly though, neither X-Pac nor Finkel had gone to hairdressing school, because their interpretation of shaving someone's head ended up just being to give the heel a stylish new look. And that meant the next time we saw Jarrett on TV, he wouldn't be bald at all. No, he'd actually just have a shorter do. Still, he played it up like it was a great embarrassment anyway, and this embarrassment eventually helped to fuel his chauvinistic heel character the following year. Of course, you all know what happened next. After getting into a pay dispute with Vince McMahon prior to October 1999's No Mercy, Jarrett would do the job to China, then be excommunicated from New York all the way up until 2018. At least during his years away, however, he was able to keep himself busy, primarily through creating TNA. And it was there that our next subject also had his head shaved, though in the case of Eric Bischoff, this would be only one of 3 occasions where the same thing happened. Yes, during his time in both WCW and WWE, Eazy-E also had a battle with a pair of scissors. So for the sake of simplicity here, let's go through each one in order. First came the time when, after having served as the megalomaniacal boss of World Championship Wrestling for too long, Ric Flair decided to get some revenge on the Detroit native back in January of 1999. How would he do this exactly? Well, after his son David made short work of him in a match during an episode of Nitro, the Nature Boy and the rest of the Four Horsemen came down to the ring to enact one final punishment on the heel, a punishment which would see him have his hair cut off while he lay there unconscious in the middle of the ring. Of course, once he woke up then, Eric was able to fully pantomime being outraged by what had occurred, but this wouldn't be the only time he'd have to deal with such an indignity as it happened, because years later in 2004, the exact same thing took place in WWE. This time, though, it wouldn't be Ric Flair who was responsible. No, instead it was his kayfabe nephew EUGENE who served as the culprit. And the reason he decided to get one over on his uncle here was because after months of getting bullied by him, he'd challenged the former WCW chief to a match at that October's Taboo Tuesday. But it wasn't just a normal match. No, as a result of an added stipulation, the winner would get to decide the loser's fate. So when EUGENE got the victory here then, he decided the best way to embarrass Bischoff was to shave his head for a second time. Still though, even this wouldn't be the last time the former Eazy-E had his locks cut off in the ring, because there would be one final occasion where such a thing occurred, and that was in March of 2015 on an episode of Impact. Yes, Eric must have a thing for being humiliated on national TV, as it was here that, now with a whole new company to play the angle out in front of, he decided to make it a hat trick. That said, it wasn't like he didn't at least try to flip the script on this occasion, because initially his plan, in kayfabe at least, had been to separate Mick Foley from his hair instead. And the reason he was doing this was because he wanted to punish Foley for helping out babyface Jeff Jarrett in a handicap match the week before. But for all Eric's efforts to finally turn the tables, in the end, it was a case of history repeating itself, as once the segment was over, the hardcore legend would have the scissors in his hands, and the heel would once again be laying in the middle of the ring, bald as the day he was born. Really, it's enough to make you almost feel sorry for him, almost. One person it's much easier to feel sorry for, though, is his kayfabe nephew EUGENE. As being portrayed as someone who is mentally challenged, you could certainly argue the decision to forcibly shave his head in 2007 was a controversial one. Yes, by this point, he'd played a heel for a few months in late 2006, but once it became apparent that wasn't working, WWE had reverted him right back to his babyface ways. So you'd think the obvious thing to do going on from there then would be for him to return to acting as the fan favorite, someone who regularly got one over on the heels despite his limitations. But if you assume that, you'd be ignoring the fact that this was around the time Vince McMahon's booking ability was declining. So rather than attempt to use Nick Dinsmore's creation as a feel-good story, the boss instead booked himself to shave EUGENE's head on an episode of Raw after the face had accidentally spilled a drink on him. And soon after this, EUGENE completely slid into irrelevance to the point where, just a few months later, he'd be released from his contract altogether. That's right, it was a situation where no one won, and everyone just came out looking bad in the end. So with that in mind, let's leave WWE behind for a second and head back over to WCW, as it was there a hair versus hair angle went much better when, in 1998, Chavo Guerrero became the latest victim of the shears. Now for some context, this one took place back in the period when, frustrated over the fact that he was constantly being outshone by his Uncle Eddie and his cheating ways, Chavo Jr. had undergone something of a psychotic break, one which saw him start bringing a hobby horse named Pepe down to the ring with him at all times. And when Pepe was destroyed in a wood chipper not long after this, it only caused him to fall that much further, far enough to the point his family were starting to worry about both him and his grip on reality. So hoping to beat some sense into his nephew, Latino Heat challenged Chavo to a hair versus hair match at that July's Great American Bash pay-per-view. Before this would even take place, however, the younger Guerrero was first forced to fight Stevie Ray, and in the process, lose to him. And it should probably be obvious then that, once Eddie came out for the real fight immediately thereafter, he'd make short work of Chavo, but given the shady nature of this second defeat, the El Paso native wasn't going to give his uncle the satisfaction of shaving his head for him. No, instead, following the bout's conclusion, he'd take a pair of scissors in his hands and start getting to work on the job himself. Of course, this not only allowed him to save some face, but it also further played into his demented character at the time, as if he was indeed so broken inside already, why wouldn't he just decide to cut his own hair off? Sure, you could argue he didn't have much hair to lose at this point anyways, as like with Kurt Angle, he was already visibly receding by then. But unlike with Kurt, at least his did grow back somewhat, enough to the point that when he eventually went over to WWE a few years later, he'd still be able to enjoy a little bit more time of not being completely bald. And even if he hadn't, it's not as if his locks were ever a big part of his character anyway, certainly not the same way they were with our next subject, because playing WWE's resident androgynous pretty boy throughout the 80s, having a good head of hair was always important to Adrian Adonis. So this made it all the more impactful then when such a thing was taken away from him at WrestleMania 3. But let's rewind for a second because we realize some younger viewers may not be that familiar with the flamboyant New York native. And that's because his heyday really came during his run across the late 70s and early 80s territory circuit, a period prior to the rise of Hulkamania. Not that he wouldn't still be around to reap some of the rewards of being an in-ring performer during the rock and wrestling era though, as by 1985, he'd have signed on the dotted line with Vince McMahon and would be from there quickly put into a program with Rowdy Roddy Piper. And with the climate of the time being less than welcoming of effeminate men overall, this made him the easy heel in the feud then, someone so hated by fans that all he had to do was come out to the ring wearing a bit of makeup and some sashes and he'd be routinely booed out of the building. But for as much as audiences hated Adonis, they didn't hate him even half as much as Piper did. And that bitterness was only fueled further when, in May of 1986, the heel attempted to usurp his Piper's Pit talk show segment with one of his own titled The Flower Shop. So seeing his gimmick being infringed upon, the kayfabe Scotsman challenged the Adorable One to a hair versus hair match at WrestleMania 3 the following year. And it was here that upon losing the bout after just 6 minutes and 33 seconds, Adonis had his beautiful mane cut off in front of a packed Pontiac Silverdome crowd, not only by Piper himself, but also by Brutus Beefcake. Yes, this was the point where Ed Leslie fully became the barber people knew him as best. And as it happened, it would also mark the downfall of Adonis's time in New York, as later that year he'd be released from his contract, something which likely made him wonder if the haircut had been worth it at all. But even if it was a relatively short run in the big leagues after his follicle sacrifice, at least the Buffalo native will always be able to say he got to wrestle in front of one of the largest crowds of all time, a major feather in his cap, no doubt. That said, for as much as this must have earned him some degree of bragging rights amongst his male peers, it's not always a man who gets their head shaved in the ring. No, on a few rare occasions it's happened to a woman too, with one of the prominent examples of this probably being the time Molly Holly cut all her hair off at WrestleMania 20. Of course, Nora Greenwald was never one to be shy about doing whatever it took to entertain fans though, as during an era where women's wrestling was still pretty much seen as a sideshow attraction, she worked hard to make sure it was, at least to some degree, being taken seriously. And that was why she actually went to management and personally requested her bout at the Showcase of the Immortals in 2004 against then women's champion Victoria be hair versus title, as she felt it would get people more invested in the actual feud between the two. Was she right about this? Well, yes, as it happened, because the match which followed turned out to be something of a sleeper hit on the night. And what made it all the more memorable was the fact that after Victoria was able to retain after under just 5 minutes, she caught the challenger at the top of the entrance ramp as she was trying to escape, and then proceeded to take an electric razor to her scalp. So needless to say, in kayfabe at least, Molly was less than pleased with this result, as over the weeks which followed, she'd have to appear on TV with her new look visible for all to see. In private though, she couldn't have been happier with how things went, as she could now rest safe in the knowledge that not only had she helped to keep the legitimacy of women's wrestling alive in WWF, but she would also serve as an inspiration for future female performers who also cut their hair off, like technical wizard Serena Deeb. And in the end, that made it all worthwhile, just as it was ultimately worthwhile for each of her male counterparts that we've discussed today, as even if they didn't have to lose their hair, they gained something even more important in the process, and that was a moment which few will ever forget.